A very, very warm welcome to this session with the title Citizen Science and Open Science, a booster for science communication and public engagement, ? I'm very happy to welcome you here. My name is Susanne. I am chair of the European Citizen Science Association and head of the science program Society and Nature at the Museum für Naturkunde in Germany, in Berlin. And I am very glad that we have this topic here in the session today about the interrelationship between citizen science and open science and science communication, both or all the three of them very important concepts. And we would like to discuss in this session with our distinguished panelists and you as the audience on how to involve citizens in research and how this can have an impact on the outcomes and the outputs of research. And there are a lot of assumptions and expectations towards citizen science and open science. And of course, in the current situation of a global pandemic, but also other crises like climate crisis or biodiversity crisis, of course, we have a lot of big challenges to consider. And I would like to know from our panelists on whether and how these challenges can be addressed through citizen science and open science. But let's dive straight into our topics today and what to expect from this session. Right now, I start with this. You will get some inputs from our speakers, and then we will this will be followed by a discussion, a general discussion amongst the panelists and you. And you have the opportunity to bring your questions to the panel through the Q&A section. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can click on the Q&A button, and then please bring your question into this section, and both my co-moderator in the background and I will have a look at the questions and bring them forward to the panel. Right, and with no further delay, I would like to introduce the speakers to you that kindly agree to be in the session today and share their extensive expertise on citizen science and open science with us. And this is Muki Haklay, Vanessa van den Bogaert, and Wehn. And we will start with Muki Haklay. Muki Haklay is a professor of geographic information science at the Department of Geography at the University College in London. He is also the co-director of the UCL Extreme Citizen Science Group, which is dedicated to allowing any community, regardless of their literacy, to use scientific methods and tools to collect, analyze, interpret, and use information about their area and activities. The core area of his research is public access, use and creation of environmental information. And with his research, Muki Haklay seeks to explore different aspects of environment and society relationships, such as public participation in environmental decision-making. He is also co-editor of the UCL open access book, Geographic Citizen Science, No One Left Behind, which was published earlier this year. I'm very, very glad that you could join and provide us your insights, Muki, as an introduction of citizen science as a field of research. And the floor is yours, Muki. Please start.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. So what I'm going to do is a whistle-stop tour of what is citizen science and what we need to notice as I'm going through that is how wide and how deep it is in different areas. It can be classified in different ways. There are over 13 or 15 different classification of citizen science. But if we're trying to capture what is citizen science, you will find it that it's got elements that have been running over 150 years or even more. It's got elements that rely on technology. So for example, citizen cyber science that only run with the internet and communication, and there is all kind of inclusive and citizen science that falls under the category of community science. You also find it in many, many ways. It can include downloading software to your computer or your phone and running things in the background while you're doing other things, and that can be in health or in material science. It can involve mapping the world in a very detailed way through a bottom-up process in the OpenStreetMap project, where people are recording information from humanitarian projects, but also things that end up in your Apple or in your Amazon services in different ways. It can be also in the humanities, with people joining in to transcribe the writing of Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher from the 19th century, or in the work that my group is doing in developing tools and data analysis and visualization for participants without literacy. And the aim is to support different groups, and in particular, indigenous groups in different parts of the world, to record information. And that is done through a participatory process in which we are co-designing pictograms and icons and developing it in such a way that people can record information. And that's already been used at a large scale in the Masai Mara in Kenya, with people in the area recording information about 170 species and their tree health and other issues. And that is combined with remote sensing data to support adaptation to climate change. So this is something that we need to kind of notice as the first aspect, that citizen science is actually like science communication, is crossing across the map of scientific discipline. But it is interesting to notice how it is integrated into the different discipline. And one thing that you do notice in many examples of citizen science is that actually, in terms of its epistemology, ontology, and methodology, it's really following the core of the discipline. So although it will be more radical in terms of who participate, in terms of the method that it will use, it will not challenge them. So if it is in the medical area, a lot of time you will see randomized control trial being used very heavily. And if it's in astronomy, you will see the creation of very large statistical data sets. So that means that we can ask questions about what are the areas where there can be radical departure from current creation of scientific knowledge in different ways. It's not that it doesn't happen, it happens in the margin. And that's also coming in this model that came from the Doing It Together science project, understanding of where citizen science fit within the wider framework of public engagement. And we can notice that if we take everyone in society and you'll kind of start considering passive consumption of science, so watching a TV program about science or reading a newspaper article about it, you are already looking at a big drop, say just 25% of the population you can estimate, or 30% will be within this passive consumption of science. But if we're thinking about living home, going to an exhibition, or participating in a scientific activity, or going to a science museum, again, a rough estimation will tell you that it's about 10% of the population that will go to active consumption of science. But that is where there are starting to be major challenges, although we want people to engage more. So say things like the Big Garden Birdwatch in the UK, where people are watching from in their garden for 1 hour, that we're getting into 2% of the population. It's fantastic to have 1 million people, but where are the 98%? And as we go to further steps in citizen science, which are available, like the volunteer computing that I showed you, the data collection and analysis, and the DIY science, we are getting into smaller and smaller groups within the population. So something that we need to think, just as with a wider issue of science communication, is how do we get more people going through this process? And that's where in the DITOS project, we were thinking about it as an escalator. What will be the things that will help us to extend the range and the participation in citizen science? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muki, for this very concise and at the same time short introduction, which is a great merit that you could put it in such a small amount of words, as it is such a growing field of research. Once again, for those who have joined us a bit later, please don't hesitate to put your questions into the Q&A section. And me and my co-moderator Vincent will bring them forward to the panelists. So don't be shy and just put them in there if you have any questions. And with that, I would like to introduce our second panelist, Vanessa van Bogaert. And she is a research assistant at the Chair for Teaching and Learning Research at the Ruhr-University in Bochum in Germany. Her research focus is on impact evaluation and citizen science perception of authenticity in science communication and extracurricular learning education. Currently, Vanessa is doing what we call accompanying research, so impact research on the citizen science project Plastic Pirates Go Europe. This campaign is a joint initiative of the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, the Portuguese Ministry of Science, Technology and Higher Education, and the Slovenian Ministry of Education, Science and Sport. Young people in their respective countries will collect relevant research data on the entry of micro and macroplastic into the seas and oceans via flowing waters and recording them on a digital map on the internet. And with her research, Vanessa van Bogaert seeks to not only describe the success of citizen science empirically, but also to explain it and to research this. Vanessa is also a contact person for the Science of Citizen Science Working Group in the German Citizen Science Network of Bürger schaffen Wissen. And Vanessa, the floor is yours, and we are very curious to hear about your impact research for citizen science projects.
Thank you, Susanne. It's nice to hear such a lot of myself. I'm a bit nervous now, but I haven't prepared a presentation because I'd just like to take you with me without introducing myself in an exhaustive way and my work. In my view, from the perspective of learning and instruction research, citizen science is an exciting learning environment. In various projects, citizen scientists and so-called professional scientists come together in a project-based setting and to generate new knowledge together. And I think that's very interesting. In those various processes, the roles of the participants are quite different, as Muki mentioned. In a more general way, scientific knowledge gains are generated at a point in time together with an audience that differs from the classical way. I think that thus communication within and about the project, the citizen science project, is even more necessary. Our research, as Susanne mentioned before, can be understood as a kind of, yes, I would say basic research, then evaluation. Through the funding from the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, We are currently working on an accompanying research for the citizen science campaign, Plastic Pirates Go Europe, and our research focus is on, I would say, being the science of citizen science focus is only on personal characteristics. For example, affective variables such as motivation or interest, as well as cognitive ones, for example, knowledge and skills. And it is especially important for us to apply scientific methods when answering the question from the science of citizen science perspective. So we have to meet the quality criteria of our own research and instruction. In doing so, it is important for us to consider the theoretical context and the optimal research design. And we initially understand criteria as the theoretically and also conceptually derived characteristics to be achieved. They usually refer to abstract constructs, such as interest, that are not directly observable. Therefore, we need to develop and evaluate indicators in order to make the expression of us criterion empirically ascertainable. In addition to the question of criteria and also indicators, the question of the right research design is still in its infancy, I would say, out of a science of citizen science perspective. And I will point out that if, for example, the effect of a citizen science project on citizen scientists is to be investigated, I would say an experimental design is necessary. Because, however, effects only can be empirically validated in a systematic comparison of at least two statistically identical groups yield a significant difference. To do this, an intervention, the thing that happened, must be controlled. It must be carried out in a precisely and in a arranged manner and under strictly controlled conditions. And consequently, I have to say it must be repeatable for every other scientist. We started in our process with a review from the international literature in the field of citizen science or science of citizen science. And we looked up for the research design that were used in and the variables which were studied in. At this point, this work is in process. I can say that experimental approaches seems to be little established, and that's why we work together on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for this short insight. I think there will be quite a few questions in the discussion and very important things that you mentioned here that I would like to explore further on. Right, but now I have the pleasure to introduce the third of our panelists, who is Wehn. She's an associate professor of Water Innovation Studies, and she's head of the Knowledge and Innovation Studies Development Group at IHE Delft. She is a social scientist from the field of science, technology, and innovation studies with a background in ICTs, drawing on more than 20 years of combined industrial research and international development experience. She leads the acquisition and implementation of large interdisciplinary research and capacity development projects. And her current citizen science projects include case studies in Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And Uta, we are very much looking forward to your inputs on with the title Citizen Scientists and Open Science about people and processes.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Susanne. It's great to be here. And I'd like to complement what we've heard from Muki and Vanessa with looking at the people and processes involved when we are talking about citizen science, open science, and indeed even the intersection between the two. So let's take a look first at the citizen scientists. These are the people at the end of the day that we're engaging. And they really come from all walks of life. They also do citizen science in all kinds of weather conditions. And they come from all kinds of areas in the world, including those that are less advantaged as far as their socioeconomic situations are concerned. So that also means that they're focusing on very different topics, be it biodiversity, but also often in the poorer parts of the world, looking at what is actually the status of the natural resources that they crucially rely on for their livelihoods. But citizen scientists, when we talk about citizen science, are not the only key stakeholders. We have others, and I'd like to illustrate this briefly by the way in which we thought about this in the Ground Truth project that was funded under Horizon 2020. Of course, citizens and communities are key stakeholders that we engage and involve in citizen science. And quite obviously, scientists themselves are also another key stakeholder. In the same bubble, we see data aggregators, because we actually also see some commercial parties in this space helping to collect, aggregate, analyze, visualize data. But importantly, on the bottom right, we have the decision makers, the policy makers, that so often when we talk about managing environment, these of course are key stakeholders who at the end of the day, we would like to have the knowledge produced in citizen science projects taken on board in the decisions that are taken on board in the policies that are drawn up. Now, this is all very well, and it sounds like a rosy picture, but of course it's more difficult. Each of these different stakeholder groups is not only not homogeneous, they also have very different motivations when it comes to engaging in citizen science and in open science. So I'd like to just very briefly take a look with a very high-level summary of some of the research that we've done into the motivations for participation. And one useful way to trying to disaggregate what's actually going on here is to say, what is actually the main driver of citizen science? We heard from Muki, of course, that there are many different ways of cutting the citizen science cake. So if citizen science were a cake, there's many different shapes and ways you can slice it. Let's simplify it and say, is it mainly about the production of scientific knowledge, really in the scientific domain? Or we also, of course, see many forms of citizen science, community science was already mentioned, community-based monitoring, etc., that is driven by a local issue where data is needed either for the agenda setting, for monitoring policies, etc. And those actually influence how, to what extent and how we can get the different stakeholders involved. So let's start with our key stakeholders, citizens. What we see overarching, without going into the nuances here, their involvement in the scientific production of knowledge is really a sense of duty. I'm doing something for the common good. I'm contributing to society at large, helping to address broad societal challenges that really require a better knowledge base. When the citizen science initiative is more about solving a local issue, we see that they're far more driven by this is the way we can get evidence and we can demand action to be taken. For the scientists, we see right now at this time in the development and evolution of citizen science, there's really great excitement to see this is a great opportunity for the way in which we do scientific work, being closer connected to the public in terms of setting the research agenda, as well as, of course, very obviously, which is what citizen science is often reduced to, in terms of data collection, filling data gaps that otherwise are difficult to achieve. And then for the policymakers, they're the main driver. Again, I just want to stress this as a high-level summary, is really to demonstrate that they're doing public participation in their work. And common to both the scientists and the decision makers, interestingly, both of them see citizen science, this is a movement, this is a new trend, and we want to be part of this. So this helps us to dissect a bit more what's going on. And what's in it for me is really the prevalent question for each of those different stakeholder groups. And then, of course, that question and the answer to it really depends which kind of communities, which groups of citizens, etc. we're talking about. Now, in order to bridge to the open science, because of course we have the dual topic of citizen science and open science today, is to say, well, what then with this understanding of citizen science is its role in open science? Is it just one ingredient, one of many components that we talk about when we talk about open science? And we typically talk about open data, open access, open infrastructure, etc. Now, we can also look at open science as saying, well, open science is about opening the scientific process. And we know the scientific process follows a scientific method with a hypothesis, selecting methods, collecting data, analyzing it, etc., and then eventually distributing it and making sure the insights are actually used. Now, I would argue here, and this is based on my role as the co-chair of the Citizen Science Open Science Community of Practice, that it's actually not enough just to open access to data publications and other research projects. Of course, that's necessary, but it's in no means sufficient to really transition to a truly open way of doing science. So this is where citizen science come in, because it can actually literally come in any step of that process. So in that sense, citizen science can be seen to provide meaning to open science in a process dimension, really making it more inclusive, more participatory at every single step of the method. Now, open science is a movement, just like citizen science is, and in fact, it's really advancing well with the initiative that was taken by UNESCO and the work towards actually coming up towards a global consensus on what we mean by open science, so that we can then produce policy on it and drive it through different member states and into the different science systems. So that process is going on, and it's not only going on, it's almost finished. So there is now a recommendation that will be up for adoption in November. Of course, the member states vote on this and decide whether they accept the final version of the recommendation on open science. But overall, I just briefly wanted to highlight this is a hugely important process when we deliberate this topic of citizen science and open science in our discussion today. So to briefly summarize, I would advocate, let's focus on the people, the citizen scientists, but also other stakeholders. When we talk about citizen science, we're involving people at the end of the day. It really helps us realize what's in it for them, but also helps us better realize what then is the role of citizen science and open science. And secondly, for the focus on open science, I would argue, let's also stop reinventing the wheel. Too many disparate discussions are going on, defining this anew, and discussion is not a bad thing. But when we have gone through a very careful global process, very formal, with member state representation, good consultation from various communities, we have a good basis to start from. So we should really communicate about that understanding of open science, just as we communicate what we mean by citizen science. And in fact, we really need good collaboration across both movements. So I would like to thank you for your attention. I will not pass up this opportunity to warmly invite you to join the Citizen Science Open Science Community of Practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uta Wehn, for your introduction to citizen science and open science. For those of you who are expecting Mirko Bischofberger, I have to say that unfortunately he had to cancel his participation on the panel today on a very short term. So he sends his apologies and greetings to all the participants of this session. And I can see from the bar in the Zoom bar down that we have 120 participants, and I'm very glad to see that there is such a high interest in this session on citizen science and open science at the bridge for science communication. So I would now like to invite all speakers, all panelists, to switch on their cameras, because we are now going into the discussion of this session. And I would like to start with maybe a broader question to all of you, because you already dive deeply into the various fields that you touched on, and I would like to ask you the question. There are really high expectations towards citizen science, and I think this was apparent in all of your speaks, and we can see this through various documents and strategies, etc. And one of them is when researchers and citizens work together on a specific question and contribute their respective expertise to the research process, a general deepening of the citizens' understanding of scientific work is expected. The question to the panel would be, is that true? Do you think this is true? That's the one thing. And the other is there evidence to this? So is the trend of citizen science, does it have this evidence that there is a deepening of understanding, an assumption that we can see in the history of science communication as well, and of citizen science right now? Muki, would you like to start?
I actually would think that Vanessa is more qualified to start it.
Okay, that's fine. Vanessa, you start.
Thank you, Muki. But I'm also not sure. Then, if we talk about knowledge or skills or something like that, can citizen scientists become after participate in a special project? That's not. There's no hard empirical evidence for. There are hopes and beliefs, and maybe that's a hypothesis. We can't say that's clear. I think the citizen science projects are so different that a general answer to this question could be no, yes or no, I think.
If I may come in, Susanne. Actually, this relates very closely to the work that we're doing in the MIX project, measuring the impacts of citizen science, where I lead the development of a conceptual framework so that we have a methodological basis for this. So in our review of the literature, I would confirm what Vanessa said. There is no hard evidence for now. There are many attempts at capturing, to what extent is knowledge and understanding actually increasing. It's a very big claim that's so often stated, but it is hardly ever backed up by evidence. Moreover, there are very few sound methodologies around to go about this. So the few attempts that we see in the literature, I think, don't have the sufficient depth, don't have the sound scientific grounding that you actually need to have when you're trying to measure whether somebody has improved their understanding. Now, many of us work as academics and we teach, so we measure improvements in understanding in terms of, assessing people's advancement of knowledge all the time. So, that's one way, making it very specific to what the specific citizen science project is about. Do I now recognize X number of bird species, for example, because I've been involved in eBird? There are generic approaches that are also available because we have, of course, the field of education science. There are existing scales that we could actually use. And what we're seeing is that across the board, actually, an impact assessment of citizen science, too little does the citizen science community actually reach out to existing scientific fields of expertise who've long dealt with the motivations, the increased understanding, the attitudes towards environmental problems, etc. So we need to become much better as a citizen science community actually to bridge those gaps and to engage with those existing scientific bodies of knowledge.
So, and I'll now come with a different approach. So basically, that's where I've pointed out about the difference between scientific discipline. So if you ask scientific understanding, I ask you which? What are you meaning by understanding the scientific method? You're bringing someone, in some medical, like it is interesting, for example, to notice how bits of the medical research spilled over into social science, and you have some RCT, randomized controlled trial fundamentalists in social science, thinking that that's the right way to assess interventions. It's not. It really doesn't work in the same way, and we actually have evidence for that and things like that. So what's going on is that doing science in the humanities is different from doing science in ecology and in other areas. Both scientists and the general public and everyone else is not noticing those things. And actually the innate process of asking questions, collecting data, and thinking about the data is also something that we don't notice how pervasive it is within modern society. We do that when we're looking for home or when we buy a camera or things like that, even without noticing. So there is here actually a continuum, and the question of how to demonstrate it is such a a question that we need also to refine it within the context. And scientists especially need to be careful about thinking that it's their science that the public need to know. It's different sciences and different ways of creating knowledge. It's also in both my work and Utta's work. There are fantastic examples of clashes between different cosmologies, so indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge that coming together and so on. So that's a different way of answering this question and asking, will there be an evidence at all? What are you looking for?
Okay, thank you very much. On this very different angles of looking into that, and if I may add another angle at this point of the discussion, is that we are looking into or the question of understanding of citizen scientists, of scientific, let's say, methods or science in general. We could also ask, do we as scientists get a better understanding of societal issues and things that people are concerned about? And are we open to this? Approach to really get the knowledge of people, their knowledge that might be tacit knowledge or everyday knowledge, which has maybe a lower standard or a lower, not standard, a lower, how to say this? So it's not seen as valuable as scientific knowledge, for instance. And I think that this is something that the citizen science community should also have a look and not forget when we talk about mutual understanding processes in citizen science and open science. But maybe I would like to, at this point, because there are questions coming in, which is great in the Q&A sections. And there is a specific question for Muki right now. Before we get onto another one is, do you feel that scientists need to share their approaches more with each other to allow a wider understanding of what they could use or include in citizen science projects?
Whoops. That's something that we know that, again, research funders in general are talking about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity a lot and looking for ways to do that. And yes, scientists, if any person here in the crowd, and especially it happens to science communicators who find themselves within interdisciplinary projects, you have experienced that probably about the misunderstanding, about assumptions of different scientists about other scientists and how they are doing the research and what count as valid research and so on. It can be a very tense process and it's a long process. And it's especially something that I have noticed, and that's why I use the map of science, and I'm kind of highlighting issues that seem to be about philosophy of science, epistemology, ontology, methodology, those terms that actually a lot of scientists never hear about their own discipline. It's taken for granted, and it's a very long process to realize that you need to understand it and you need to start to negotiate it with other people. And that does influence also citizen science, because a lot of time in citizen science, you will get someone who joined your project who came from a different discipline. So the fact that we have overrepresentation of people with higher education means that from time to time, you'll get someone with a PhD in a different area, and they will start asking questions from their disciplinary perspective on the specific area of the project. And that creates kind of integral interdisciplinarity inside citizen science, which make it both challenging and interesting.
So if we go one step further here, does that mean that citizen science has is the opportunity to kind of revolutionize how we think about science, even within the scientific community?
I would say it all depends. Sorry, because the devil is in the detail. There are many shades of gray. We use the big term citizen science, but it so much depends who's the initiator, you know, what is the governance structure of the entire process, to what extent is it really inclusive, participatory, and all the other good things we want it to be and we claim it to be. But it really comes down to, you know, how sound is the process by which we actually implement citizen science. And so that's where we actually have a big task to educate all of the relevant stakeholders that we need in it, that this is not a quick fix, you know, this is not a matter of knocking together some apps and some sensors and, you know, and deciding on locations. It's a far more complex process, and that makes it a bit more difficult, or quite a bit more difficult. But other than that, we also can't claim that we get the good results out of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Uta. So it all depends. Good. I see that there are more questions coming in the Q&A, and I think there's one question that also got quite some likes right now, and this is opening up the broader framing of this session within the conference as well. And this is, I think, very valid question. So Friederike Schmidt says, I have participated at a lot of open science conferences, and often citizen science is part of it. Science communication, however, is almost never mentioned as such. Can you elaborate how you see science communication being part of open science versus citizen science?
Well, I could answer it from the UNESCO perspective. As I mentioned, quite a collaborative process has gone on in different communities. The science communication community, the citizen science community, etc., you know, were brought into the process to the extent that this was possible, such a global process. What we see reflected in the final recommendation is very explicit attention to science communication and very explicit attention to citizen and participatory science, because that was the term that at the end of the day, member states could settle on. So again, we see, of course, you know, terminology matters and you know, the kind of semantic load it has for different communities. But science communication is a very explicit part of open science in the emerging global consensus on open science.
And if another aspect of it is also in the escalator that I was showing in the in my presentation. So the escalator that we developed during the DITOS project was trying to make sense of a whole range of activities and a way not to kind of push people to go up. We don't envisage a world where everyone is doing DIY bio every evening on their kitchen table. That's not the actual vision. But it's a vision that opens up the opportunities, that takes into account all the problems that Cici was mentioning at the beginning, at the keynote this morning, like science capital, awareness to scientific issue, ability, time, resources, all these kind of issues in society, and to think how we get people from the general understanding of science. At the bottom of it is that if you're not aware of the issues, you won't get engaged, all the way to getting into the stages of your own project. And that requires bigger investment by the scientists and other stakeholders to make it happen and to make it inclusive. So in each of the levels of this escalator, you can see a really clear role for science communication in promoting, recruiting, engaging, reporting results, and all the rest of it. So I would see it as an integral aspect of citizen science on its different forms. And I would actually interested in Susanne's experience, because she got, among us, she got a PhD in science communication.
True enough, but I would like to first pass over the word to Vanessa if she wants to add to this.
No, thank you. I'm not an expert in science communication, Susanne. I would be happy if you
That's fine. Okay, so if everybody permits, I'm just going to put my hat as moderator by the side. And as Muki has mentioned earlier, my PhD is exactly on that question. So I was really pleased to see it in the chat. And of course, as Uta has mentioned earlier, it all depends. It depends on the perspective that you take. So from one side, I would say, if we look at it from a meta perspective, we can say that citizen science is a development of science communication. If we look at it from the perspective of models of science communication, so to say, because we go from, if we start with a deficit model, a one-way communication towards a public understanding of science, and then public engagement with science, and then we can say, oh, if we engage in scientific processes with citizens, we become part of a whole project. So there is no distinction between this is a societal group and this is a scientific working group. So we are all part, we form the part of a project team. And with that, we bring science communication to a next level. On the other side is that, as Muki has mentioned earlier, is that, of course, science communication is key to citizen science projects if we look at the project level. Because if you fail to communicate well and to create a mutual understanding for all partners in the scientific process, and in the collaboration of this project, then your whole project will fail. It's not that science communication is, as in conventional projects, just kind of a maybe sometimes nice to have part, but it's really fundamental to the whole endeavor of the citizen science project. So I would highly recommend to bring science communication more into the debate of citizen science, of course, and also of open science, where it is already a part. But we could, maybe that would be a different session as well. And I hope with that, I'm taking on the hat of the moderator again. So thanks for the question right now. I would like to come back to the question of the impact again. And Vanessa, I think this is really your what you are doing right now in your accompanying research. The question to me is, if we have those high expectations towards citizen science, and we want to see how does that participate in research really impact on different levels. And maybe you could explain a bit more on how you really want to do this in your project in the plastic pirates, and better understand on it all depends, of course, but how would you really how are you going about this to measure the impact, or to get to the point where we can really say we can fill that gap that Uta mentioned earlier, that the current literature, scientific literature, and those research approaches don't really show what the evidence is and how it works. And this is, of course, something that we want to have, because we all believe in citizen science and open science approaches, I think, or most of us. But we also have to show that we are making an impact. So Vanessa.
Thank you, Susanne. I will talk about the Plastic Pirates Go Europe project. That's a citizen science project for students in classes. That's a special target group, I think. And the students participate in this project as a whole class within the normal time in school. And the teachers bought for them books and materials, and so they can do the their field trial to sample micro and macroplastic. And we used for our research a panel study. We asked the teachers with questionnaires, and we also asked the pupils with questionnaires. And that is a panel for to find out who is participating, why do they participate in. And then after the panel, we plan an experimental study, and we will, under controlled conditions, we will find out is it a change in something, a change in interest or in motivation, or a change in trust in science or something like that. We will find out in controlled conditions, is it because they have participated in this project, in the Plastic Pirates project, or is it because any other things happened in time around the participation. So we use classical psychology methods to find out the effect which come from the participation inside the project. That's, yes, I think more basic research than evaluation, because the questions are so basic to it.
I would also like to come in and perhaps share what we do in the MIX project. I think we all realize that impacts take a long time to materialize, and they're difficult to measure, and typically there aren't the resources around. Having said that, you know, it still can be done. And so the approach that we're taking in the MIX project, where we're working with hands-on citizen science in the field of nature-based solutions, we've helped co-design these citizen science initiatives to either make the case that there should be a nature-based solution for a creek in Hungary, for example, or that a wetland that has been created already as a nature-based solution should be maintained. In both cases, you need evidence of how actually the physical environment is changing, how it affects people's life, how it affects the local economy, the tourist industry, etc. So we've built, again, we haven't reinvented the wheel, we've built on the theory of change. The theory of change shows how your own activities and the outputs that you create with those, where they're going to go, who are you expecting to do anything with the data that you generate. And by doing that together, not only with the citizen science project managers, but particularly also with the citizen scientists themselves, that is citizen science communication in practice, because you discuss everything that's going on in a citizen science project, including the impacts you're aiming for. So there's so much we can do as a team, but actually the citizen scientists and local stakeholders, of course, are much better placed to know what they're aiming for, and therefore also what they would like to measure. So we do what we do co-evaluation or participatory impact assessment with them, because we come up with indicators for how are you going to measure this increased stakeholder engagement that you're aiming for, or in a specific project that actually the uptake of the data by a specific authority. What evidence can we have? Who is collecting that information? How do we know which civil servant will end up having our citizen science data on their desk, etc.? So just to say, you know, there are concrete ways in which we can do it. There's a certain amount of generalization that we can do with drawing on existing indicators, existing insights that the citizen science community has generated, but making it case specific, because we can't get away from the case relevance, that the specific impacts that any citizen science initiative aims for is so specific that it's very difficult to just translate it up to these very generic indicators.
Thank you very much. This brings me to another point that I consider really interesting in citizen science. And Muki, that might be a question to you as well. If we look at what Uta just described, this process where we discuss within a citizen science project, what are your motivations, what's your interest in participating? Is there sometimes, can there be a clash of interests between what the scientists want and what the citizen scientists do want, and how to deal with that? I mean, you have briefly shown the cases of your extreme citizen science group's work with less literate communities maybe, but they might have very, very different interests. So how is that a problem? And if yes, how to deal with that? Could you unmute yourself, please?
Sorry. There can be, and it's actually there was a whole concept of from Sheila Jasanoff about technology and science of humility, about not going to communities and assuming that you know everything and you have scientific understanding that will solve the situation. In our cases, it's easier because we come with a paradigm from the start that we would like people to co-create in a very strong way. We actually discuss that in a detailed way at the beginning of the project. But I have over the years experience of clashes between what the scientists that came with predefined hypotheses about the neighborhood and what the community members were thinking. And sometimes it led to a parallel data collection process that actually the scientists collected what they were thinking about, and that proven not to be part of what the people in the area thought that it's important or significant. There are also cases where scientists are looking for different things, and it doesn't mean that science, that all science need to be full of citizen science all the time. It's got a place, it's got type of activities that are suitable for it. There will be other activities that are not suitable for it. I can just recommend, for example, in the environmental area, there was a report from the Center for Ecology and Hydrology on choosing and using citizen science that even got a kind of decision tree to help people in figuring out which type of problems are suitable for it and not.
Yeah, like Muki, I'm a big believer in co-creation and co-design. We do this in our project. However, there's no guarantee that there won't be clashes. It's normal. We're a society, we're diverse people, we have different views, different agendas. And you also don't start with a blank page as far as these stakeholder relationships are concerned. So even if you do it bottom up, even if you co-design it, it's more than putting some people in a room say, oh, we're doing this nice science project, wouldn't you all like to be part of it? It's really, at the end of the day, the question, who's in power here? Who can call the shots? Are we being clear of what's going on? That this is a very science-driven project and it has little room. If we articulate it, I think we get stakeholders on board more. But if we do a truly bottom-up process, we need to make time for it. We need to make sure that we bring the right people to the table. And sometimes this means that we have dual co-design processes going on during the day with civil servants, in the evenings with volunteers. And then you slowly work towards a process when you get them in the same room together. So there's more than meets the eye, when we say, co-creation, co-design are the answer. We need to carefully think about the ways in which we do that.
And this brings another question to the table, and is that, are all scientists capable of taking those roles? I mean, these are roles that might maybe in a conventional science setting you never do as a scientist. You're doing your research and you collect data, but then what you describe, Uta, and what you've just described, Muki, is really to communicate with people to create an understanding, or maybe to facilitate a process, a co-creation process, and that is quite a challenging task, right? So how to deal with that?
Well, who says that the scientists need to be in charge? There are many forms of citizen science, but certainly one good way to get around this is for people also to realize what their strengths and weaknesses are and what their role in the project is. And, some natural scientists often don't feel so comfortable doing that. But if you already realize, you need somebody to facilitate, A, you need a co-design process, and B, you need somebody with the skills to facilitate that for you, then you're 3 steps ahead, because you can hopefully bring in the resources, bring in the right people to do it for you. Just because we do citizen science doesn't mean the scientists now all of a sudden need to take on all these important roles and steps as part of the process.
And I would see also a parallel with science communication. There is now a role, a place, and profession of people who are doing science communication. And now we're also seeing the public engagement area. So I'll do shameless plug about the fact that at UCL, we are starting an MSc in citizen science next year, exactly because of this what might seem at first look at a contradictory thing about why are you professionalizing this volunteer area, but volunteering is professionalized. You need to know how to do it. You need to know also when to use volunteers and when it is ethical and appropriate to figure out how you pay for your participants in different ways. You also need, you see this rapid evolution of also knowledge in the field. So what Vanessa is doing is actually creating knowledge that we will need to give to practitioners. And they will need to know how to do that. And they will need also to know how to use the proper co-evaluation methods and other things. So all that calls for people who know what they are doing, who can guide it, can link to bodies like the one that you are leading, the EXA and other things like that. And understand, also have an understanding in science communication appropriately. They will be a bit generalist because they will know, it's not mean that they will know everything about the data analysis, about app design, the number of cases where people approach you as someone who's doing citizen science and tell you, I want to develop an app where people will collect X, and then you tell them, but it won't work like that, is something that all of us in the field experience. So those kind of things require people to learn about it. And I would see the role of people who specialize in this field. And we're actually seeing them emerging. All of us are in the call, are in a way falling into that. But now we are at the stage where we can help people to get into this area.
Yes, thank you very much. Also to bringing in the perspective and the bridge to science communication. So I'm having a look at the Q&A section, and there is something. There's a question that several people would like to get an answer to, and that would be, how do you get scientists to participate in citizen science project? How's the recruitment process? What are the incentives? And we know, and this holds true for science communication too, and this is a big debate, at least in Germany, and I think in the UK it has been tackled a bit. They are a bit ahead of us, but still, we have the restraints that we have to publish, we have to acquire funding, etc. And science communication, and of course citizen science, as we have heard, is quite a demanding process. How can we bring in scientists to do this? And the question goes further: are you usually reaching the scientists that are already practicing citizen science, or you try to reach scientists that are less motivated to be involved in science engagement activities and have never done so? So what's your take on that? And Vanessa, maybe you would like to start?
Yes, I would like to start, but I can't say something because our target group are pupils and teachers and no scientists. I'm sorry.
Well, if I can perhaps share what we do in our work, we do mostly co-design citizen science initiatives. So it doesn't start with the science, it doesn't start with a gap in data, it starts with an issue. And then once you work through what the specific challenges you're trying to address, then you realize, well, I need a biodiversity expert, or I need a water quality expert, I need a limnologist. You try and bring them in. Now, one of the assumptions that's sort of part of the question, I guess, is that scientists will only participate if they're paid for it, if it's part of their professional life. That may be true in the majority of cases, but equally, they could also volunteer their time. So let's not disregard that opportunity. But if we engage them as part of their professional life, indeed, the incentive system for them is important, is hugely important to take into account. Luckily, a lot of attention is being paid to that as part of the open science recommendations. So hopefully we see some trickling down of that, changing the science system and the incentives in it as the open science recommendation is pushed through science policy, relevant ministries, institutions, etc. But that's a long time off. In the meantime, one of the most straightforward ways to involve scientists then in our projects is if we can make resources available to draw on their expertise. And as I said, from our research, it shows right now there is actually a good deal of openness to be part of it. Because many scientists realize, hang on, there's a paradigm shift going on here. I'd better be part, or at least I should know what this citizen science thing is all about. So any project that they can get their hands on, they can play a role in, be involved, even as an advisory board member, whichever form it may be, is an opportunity for them to learn about citizen science, learn about the practice, and build important partnerships. We all know science is funded, research funded, so we need to write proposals together. So any single citizen science project always is a possible spin-off opportunity for scientists then to get follow-on funding in.
And I would add that there are several things. So first of all, there is there is a difficulty there. There is no question about it. I keep on coming back to a survey in the UK that demonstrated that 70% of scientists never shared anything about the research on any social media. It is. So between that and getting engaged in something that requires effort and reaching out to people, there is a very long distance. And I myself experienced 8 years where I was looking for a chemist to carry out and work together on air quality project with communities. And yes, it took 8 years until I found someone who was willing to collaborate. And it's not easy. So what should we do? First of all, there are changes in institutions. So you can look up, there is another EU project called Time for CS, which is about institutional roadmaps to adopting citizen science. And there is already a well-established report by the League of European Research Universities on how universities can support it. There is a lot of influence by funders. So it was mentioned again in the morning about Horizon Europe and the way that engagement and citizen science is actually appearing now in many programs. And we're actually seeing some interest of people to join in those calls. So funding is a different thing. Another thing is exploration funding from research funders. So in the UK, for example, the UK Research and Innovation created a program where they deliberately called for scientists who never participated in citizen science to join forces with people who are familiar with it and then carry out research. The funding is not yet significant, and there are all sorts of issues with that, but that's a signal to the research community that this is an important area. There is also a really innovative program that was created by the chief scientist in Quebec, where they again called for not just to people who never participate in it, but actually for community leadership in the project. So the scientists are joining the community who established the research. And again, it was an interesting program to look around. So there are multiple factors, and the same as with science communication and public engagement, they involve multiple areas. If you'll look up again Time for CS, the project, we hope to start sharing examples of how different institutions created a transition to support scientists through the process.
And maybe to add on this on a very practical basis, there are, for those who might be hesitant on what to expect from citizen science and how to engage from the scientific, as a scientist, there are different ways that citizen science platforms try to address this. And if you go on the European basis, you go on eucitizen.science homepage, the platform, you can find a lot of resources, training workshops, etc., that are especially designed for people who are interested in citizen science and might need some kind of training or advice on that. So that's a great resource. And others are thinking of different models, and I know that the Austrian Citizen Science Network, for instance, they are currently setting up a kind of a mentoring program where more experienced citizen science researchers give advice to newbies in the field of citizen science, which I think is a great idea because it creates it supports the network and is a very low level, not low level, but without a great effort to get in contact with people and exchange your on your very specific questions that you might have. Ute, yes.
Yeah, may I add, on this topic of, learning from each other, learning from citizen science practitioners as peers, I would like to highlight the work that we've done in the We Observe project, which is available. On the one hand, we've set up communities of practice on different topics, so you're very welcome to join those. We can share the link. We have a MOOC, because not everybody might have time to sign up for Muki's masters, but a MOOC is a lighter form of then, bringing yourself up to speed, what's involved in really setting up a citizen science project. And last but not least, we've made available what we call a cookbook, the We Observe cookbook, where literally all the aspects we've discussed today, there's dedicated pages with examples from projects, really key resources where you can find out more. How do I co-design a citizen science project? How do I capture impact? How do I collect the data, analyze the data, visualize the data, etc.? How do I share it, etc.? So there's huge amounts of material available.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just looking at the time. We do have a couple of minutes left and a lot of questions. So I'm just taking the one by Justus Henke, which I think is very interesting. Is there something he's asking, like a natural boundary for citizen participation in an open science framework, thinking of eligibility of self-organized research outside or without academia for research grants, for instance, through EU research programs. Uta, maybe that would be a question for you.
Yeah, perhaps the most immediate thing that springs to mind is one of the main notions of open science, of course, is open data. And when we talk about citizen science, particularly bottom-up, community-driven citizen science, that can't always be upheld for very good reasons. For example, when we do work in Africa, we don't want to reveal the location of endangered animals, endangered species to poachers, because they're endangered for that very reason. So you need to very carefully work around this. So that's where there is, of course, a big synergy and great opportunities to work within an open science paradigm as you do citizen science. But you need to carefully, particularly with respect to open data, carefully work through and find solutions, aggregating data, and making sure you don't disclose location, etc. So we can't necessarily say that all citizen science will have open data. Often that's on a case by case, needs to be carefully looked at.
Yes, thank you very much. Uta, again, maybe you could there's the question, if you could put the link to the MOOC and the cookbook in the chat, that would be just lovely. And maybe Vincent, you could put the for instance, the link to the EU citizen science platform in there as well. That might be very good.
Yeah, and the cookbook is fantastic. As the review, I really liked it. But
okay.
I thought it's great.
Yes, all right.
I was lucky to have an early view of it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Your help was much appreciated.
Another thing that it's worth plugging, and if someone is interested, on the EU Citizen Science platform, we just released Introduction to Citizen Science for Journalists as a 1.5-hour training, self-directed unit. It's a very early release. So if someone wants to evaluate it and give us feedback, please get in touch. And we hope to completely released it by July, but that will be another resource. So for example, it starts with 5 stories about citizen science that might be really helpful also for people here.
Okay, I'm just trying to scan the very interesting questions, and I'm really sorry, but I have to pick up one from the chat, and that would be from Andrea Troncoso. What are your experiences and views about citizen science boosting public confidence in science? And maybe that goes back a bit or takes the loop to the beginning of our session as well. So what about building confidence in science through citizen science? Who wants to take a short answer to this?
Yeah, I think a short answer is difficult. In our projects, we have seen, I think, generally we see increasing confidence, but particularly through the discussion. It's not just, you know, that people are told this is how you measure things. It's the real engagement with the scientists and understanding why this is an appropriate measure and that one isn't, why this is an appropriate analysis method and why this one isn't, and how careful you need to be when you visualize the data, because that, again, you know, has a huge room for misinterpretation, creating biases, etc. So working through all these steps jointly with citizen scientists, I think that's when we can really see the increase in confidence.
Okay, perfect. So maybe just one or two sentences again from Vanessa and Muki to close the session as well, and Uta. The title was Citizen Science and Open Science. Is it a booster for science communication and public engagement? What's your take-home message for our participants?
My take is that there is plenty of opportunity, and notice, for example, the way that the European version of open science is much more opening up opportunities for science communication and engagement compared to the American one, which is basically something that the scientists focus in, and it's open science for scientists and not for the wider environment. So it's really important to engage with the discussion and to see where are the synergies and to develop them further.
Thank you, Muki. Vanessa, what's your...
I would also say we have to come together and to systemize these discussions about it and to talk and think about it together.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was just pasting the links here. Yeah, I think the potential is huge, but we can't think about it too simplistic. I think we just need to pay careful attention. Science as it is hard enough and requires us to be trained, you know, factoring in all kinds of people into that process, you know, adds complexity, adds also richness, but we just need to be humble enough to realize that and pay attention to it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for our distinguished panelists for this great session, very interesting thoughts, and I would like to very much also thank the participants for their interesting questions, for listening, for their attention, and maybe yeah, I'm looking forward to more discussions. Continue this. You're also heartily invited to come to the citizen science various events, conferences, etc. Let's intensify the discussion around science communication and citizen science. But for now, we have to close, unfortunately. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the organizers. Thanks for the co-moderation in the background. And thanks again to Vanessa van den Bogaert, Uta Wehn, and Muki Haklay for being on the panel today. And see you soon. Have a great conference. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.